Lone Mesa, West Texas. Autumn, 1879. The sky bled crimson across the horizon, and dusk settled over the dry plains like a silent promise of cold. Inside a modest log cabin on the rim of the mesa, Rachel Garrett knelt by the hearth, coaxing a flame to life. The wind hissed through the gaps in the shutters, a lonely sound. She wore her late husband's flannel coat, its warmth a poor substitute for the man himself, her hands raw from the morning's work. She had just added a handful of juniper twigs to the fire when the knock came, rapid, desperate, and utterly unfamiliar. Rachel straightened, her breath catching. Another knock, harder this time, more urgent. Her hand went to the rifle leaning against the doorframe, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Then a voice cut through the wind, cracked with exhaustion and pleading. "Please, milk, my son. He is dying." She froze. Slowly, cautiously, she unbarred the door. On her porch stood a tall Apache man, his shoulders broad and his eyes dark pools of exhaustion. In his arms, wrapped in a thin, filthy blanket, was a baby whose breath was a shallow whisper. His mouth was dry and cracked, his eyes sealed shut. Behind the man, across the dusty field, lanterns bobbed in the dark. A cluster of townsfolk had gathered, their fearful whispers carried on the wind. "It's an Apache," one woman hissed. "Don't you let him in." Rachel didn't hear them. Her gaze was locked on the infant, on the sharp ridges of his ribs visible even through the blanket. She stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady. "Give him to me." The warrior's grip tightened for a fraction of a second. "I have milk," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. "He will die out here in the cold." With solemn, haunted eyes, he passed the child into her arms. The transfer was so gentle, it broke her heart. Inside, by the warmth of the fire, Rachel sat and unbuttoned her dress. She guided the baby's mouth to her breast. The child's lips fumbled weakly, then, with a surge of instinct, latched on. A shaky breath escaped her. The warmth of the infant against her skin was an almost painful memory, and tears she hadn't realized she was holding slipped down her cheeks as the baby began to nurse. The Apache man knelt by the open door, unmoving, a sentinel carved from shadow and grief. The firelight flickered over the deep lines of fatigue etched into his face, and over a crude, crusted wound near his collarbone. "You saved him," he whispered, his voice raw. "You saved us both." Rachel didn't answer. She just held the child closer, rocking slightly. The baby's tiny hands, no bigger than curled leaves, twitched against her. "What is your name?" she asked softly. "Elan Nantan," he replied. She looked from his face to the infant's. "And his?" Elan hesitated, a shadow crossing his features. "He was born Takla Shim. We have not spoken his name since his mother passed." Rachel nodded, a familiar ache tightening in her chest. Behind them, a gust of wind slammed a shutter closed. The angry murmurs from outside had not faded. Righteousness, she thought, was so often just fear in disguise. Still holding the child, she rose and walked back to the open doorway. The townsfolk watched her from the darkness. "He's just a baby," she called out, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And no child starves on my porch." One by one the lanterns turned and moved away, their light swallowed by the night. Inside, Elan Nantan slowly unfastened a leather cord from his neck. From it hung a single, broad feather streaked with dark tips. He held it out to her. Red-tailed hawk. In my tribe, it means protection for one who gives life. Rachel looked at the feather, then at him. I didn't do it for thanks. He gave a single, slow nod. It belongs to you now. She took it, its texture surprisingly soft, and set it carefully beside the sleeping child. The fire popped, and the baby's breathing was steadier now, deeper. I don't know what this all means, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Only that he is breathing, Ellen said, his voice a low rasp. And for now, that is enough. In the flickering glow of the hearth, a warrior and a widow sat beside the same flame. And in the silence where fear had lived moments before, there was only the sound of a child nursing. They did not speak again that night, but something had begun. Something that neither war nor whispers nor the coming winter could undo. In the week that followed, Rachel Garrett began to measure time not by the sun or the moon, but by the knock that came each morning just after dawn. Aylin Nantan would appear wrapped in a worn wool blanket, carrying the child she had begun to call Nathaniel. The baby's cries had softened. His skin no longer stretched tight with thirst. His small hands would reach for her the moment he saw her face. You named him, Ellen observed one morning, watching from the doorway as she settled into her rocking chair by the fire. I had to call him something, she explained, her fingers gently tracing the fine black hair on his head. Nathaniel. It means gift of God. It felt right. Elan didn't meet her eyes, but she saw the faintest of nods. Later, she set a pot of pinto beans and smoked venison over the fire. When Elan returned that afternoon to collect the boy, she handed him 2 slices of cornbread wrapped in cloth. For the road, she said simply. He hesitated. You owe me nothing more. This isn't a debt, she replied, her voice soft. It is because he is hungry, and so are you. That night, long after the cabin was quiet, Rachel stood by the window. The moon hung like a silver coin above the plains. Her eyes scanned the darkness, and there, beneath the twisted silhouette of a cottonwood, she saw him. A still, silent figure, watching over her home. Her breath caught, not with fear, but with something else entirely. A sense of presence, of protection. The next morning, after they had gone, Rachel returned from the well to find a small object sitting beside the cradle. It was a tiny horse, carved from dark cedar, no longer than her palm. Its legs were bent in a full gallop, its mane flowing with an imagined wind. Across its back, a tiny leather strip was laid like a saddle for a rider too small to see. She turned it over. Carved into the wood were words. So he will remember his courage. When Elan returned that evening, she met him at the door, holding up the horse. You made this? Yes, he said. It's beautiful. It is Apache, he answered. The horse is freedom, strength. My son must know this, even if he grows among your people. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. You can come in. He crossed the threshold for the first time. He sat on the floor near the hearth while she cradled Nathaniel, the silence between them comfortable, easy. The fire crackled, a warm and steady heartbeat in the room. You are not what they say you are, she murmured. I am what this land has made me, Elin replied, his gaze on the flames. But I have never brought harm to your people. She nodded. I believe you. Outside, coyotes cried to the moon. Inside, trust was taking root, not in grand declarations, but in small, silent things. A bowl of stew, a carved horse, and a man who stood watch in the darkness, not to threaten, but to guard. Later, when the fire had burned low, Rachel stirred the coals, watching them pulse red. Nathaniel slept soundly in his cradle between them. He had red hair, she began, her voice so quiet it was nearly lost to the wind. My son, Elijah, just a wisp of it, like an autumn leaf. He was 6 weeks old when the fever came. Aelin said nothing, but his gaze was a steady weight upon her. I tried everything, she continued, her eyes fixed on the dying embers. I held him against my skin for hours, praying my own warmth could fight the cold that was taking him. It could not. She paused. My husband left 3 months later, said he couldn't live in a house that reminded him of a grave. Slowly, Ellen reached into a pouch at his waist and drew out something wrapped in deerskin. He handed it to her. Rachel unfolded the cloth. Inside was a square of rough linen, time-stained and soft. At its center, embroidered in golden thread, was a sun with long, spindled rays. The stitches were imperfect, but made with a loving hand. My wife, Ellen said, his voice low and even. She made this for our son's naming day. He never received it. Soldiers came with the next moon. She died protecting him. I lost them both before the earth grew warm again. Rachel held the cloth as if it were spun glass. In our tribe, Elin continued, the sun heals what words cannot. She swallowed hard. And now you carry the sun. His jaw tensed. Sometimes, I think I carry only shadow. She reached across the cradle, her fingers lightly brushing his. You brought him to me, she whispered. That was light. He looked down at their hands, then back at the sleeping boy. I feared you would turn us away. I feared, she confessed, that I had nothing left to give. The fire cracked, spitting a final spark. They sat like that, two souls bent by loss, but no longer broken. In the stillness, something fragile but strong was taking root. It did not yet have a name, but it felt like healing. Word traveled fast in Lone Mesa. By the fourth day, Rachel could feel the town's judgment in the way people paused on the road, their whispers just loud enough to be carried on the wind. They say she's nursing a redskin's baby. Lost her mind, is what it is. That afternoon, the rumble of hooves shattered the quiet. Rachel was inside, humming to Nathaniel, when a harsh voice called her name. Rachel Garrett! Come out here now! She stepped onto the porch, the baby nestled against her shoulder. 6 men stood in her yard, led by Amos Dilliard, the owner of the feed store. His face was red with rage, and the men behind him held their rifles with an easy menace. You're betraying your own kind, Amos growled. Sheltering him, feeding his child. Have you forgotten what they've done in these parts? The raids, the blood? Rachel looked down at Nathaniel's sleeping face. I remember what blood looks like, Amos, she said softly. He is not one of us, another man shouted. He's a child, Rachel replied, her voice calm, and he was hungry. She walked down the steps, her bare feet pressing into the warm earth, and stood before them. The baby stirred, and without hesitation, Rachel adjusted her shawl and brought Nathaniel to her breast. A collective gasp rippled through the men. Their self-righteous anger faltered, replaced by stunned disbelief. Rachel lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. "This child is not your enemy," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But you are beginning to sound a great deal like mine." The air grew thick with a silence that thundered. Then slow, measured footsteps approached from the road. It was Miriam Quinn, the preacher's widow, her hair a silver crown, her eyes missing nothing. She carried a small, covered pot, steam rising faintly from its lid. She walked past the circle of men without a word, set the pot on Rachel's front step, and looked from Rachel to the nursing child. "Chicken stew," she said quietly, "for the mother, for the baby. You feed him, Rachel. It's what mothers do." Then she turned and walked away, her back straight and unafraid. The silence that followed was heavier than the midday sun. Amos spat in the dirt. "This ain't over," he muttered, before turning and storming off, his men trailing behind him like sheep. That night, when Alon returned, she served him a bowl of the stew. He ate slowly, his eyes guarded. When he finished, he set the bowl aside. "They came," he said. It wasn't a question. "They left," she replied. His gaze drifted to the cradle. "And the woman with the stew?" A small, weary smile touched Rachel's lips. "Kindness is stronger than fear, Elan, but you have to choose it." She placed her hand over his on the rough-hewn table. His fingers closed around hers, warm and surprisingly gentle, bridging the vast chasm between their two worlds. They came just after dusk, when the crickets fell silent, and a tremor of wrongness ran through the air. Nathaniel whimpered in his cradle, sensing it too. Elon was by the fire, sharpening a blade, but he paused, lifted his head, and listened. Boots, horses, angry voices, then a violent pounding on the door. "Rachel Garrett, you got one chance, open up!" Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs, but as she rose, it was not with fear, but with certainty. Elin was already at the door, a tall, silent shadow. "Let me," she whispered, placing a hand on his back. She unlatched the door. Amos Dilliard stood there, flanked by his men. This time their rifles were not slung across their backs. They were held at the ready. "I warned you," Amos spat, his eyes darting from Rachel to the powerful figure behind her. "Hand over the Apache and the boy." Rachel did not move. Aylin stepped fully into the doorway beside her. He was unarmed, but his presence was as solid as the mesa itself. "You don't belong here," one of the men sneered. "Not with her. Not with that child." Aylin's silence was more unsettling than any threat. "Say something, savage," the man taunted, stepping forward. He lunged, his hand reaching for the cabin's interior. The movement was a blur. Before his hand crossed the threshold, Ellen caught his wrist. With a single, fluid motion, he twisted, forcing the man to his knees with a cry of pain. The man's rifle clattered to the ground. The others tensed, but no one moved, pinned by Elon's unwavering gaze. Elon stepped out onto the porch, placing himself between Rachel and the mob. He looked from the man on the ground to Amos, his voice low and carrying with absolute authority. "You do not own this land. You do not own her." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them all, before returning to Rachel, a flicker of something fierce and protective in his eyes. And you will never own this child. Then he looked back at the stunned faces of the men. She is his mother, he declared, the words ringing out in the cold night air. And I am his father. His mouth worked, opening and closing on silent words, before he finally found his voice, a venomous hiss. You'll regret this. All of you. Rachel drew herself up, her spine a rod of defiance. You are not the law here, Mr. Dillard, and neither is your fear. Amos's glare shifted from her to Elin, then he turned, his shoulders tight with defeat. Let's go. One by one the men followed, with Ethan trailing last, rubbing a bruised wrist and muttering curses into the cold night air. When they were gone, Rachel shut the door, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the sudden quiet. She leaned against the heavy wood, letting out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Elin bent down, retrieving the fallen rifle, and set it gently against the wall. Are you hurt? She asked, her voice soft. No, he said, the single word a bedrock of calm. Rachel looked at him then, the man who had not drawn a weapon, had not shouted nor threatened. He had simply stood his ground, with the kind of profound stillness that is forged only in years of fire. What you said, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Was it true? Elin's eyes, dark and deep, softened. What part? That I am his mother. He moved toward the cradle, where Nathaniel stirred, a small sound escaping his lips, before he drifted back to sleep. You fed him. You held him. You stayed, Elin said, his voice low and certain. No blood could make you more his mother than that. And you? She asked, her heart a fragile thing in her chest. I was ready to die for him, he answered, the truth of it ringing in the small cabin. So, yes, I am his father. They stood there for a long moment, the three of them. A woman who once grieved alone, a man who thought his people's story had ended, and a child born into the fire, now cradled in the arms of those who chose love over legacy. Outside, the wind shifted again, a mournful cry across the plains, but inside the air held steady, warm and still. Elon, warrior of the Apache, placed a hand gently on Rachel's shoulder, a silent promise. We do not run from the fire. We stand in it, together. Later, when the moon rose high above the ridgeline, silvering the hills and casting a quiet glow over the little cabin, the fire burned low, bathing the room in amber light. Rachel stood barefoot on the cool floorboards, the carving knife Elon had lent her held tightly in one hand. With the other, she guided its tip to the heavy wooden beam that stretched across the ceiling, directly above the cradle. Letter by letter, slow and steady, she worked. Nathaniel. Nathaniel. She whispered the name aloud, carving it deep into the grain of the wood, a permanent mark upon their home. There, she murmured. Now the walls will remember you too. From his chair by the hearth, Elin shifted. His face was pale in the firelight, glistening with a fine sheen of sweat. A dark stain of blood soaked the cloth wrapped around his thigh, a brutal reminder of the deer that had kicked out in a final wild burst of panic. He had carried the animal all the way back, refusing to leave it behind. Rachel crossed the room and knelt beside him, She carefully untied the bloodied bandage, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart. Dipping a clean rag into a bowl of boiled water, she began to clean the wound, her touch gentle. "You should have waited," she said softly. "You should have let me go." "I have hunted since I could walk," he replied, his voice strained. "The deer would not have waited for you." A soft, breathy laugh escaped her. "Stubborn man." He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched. As she finished cleaning the gash and began to wrap it with fresh linen, her fingers lingered on his skin, feeling the heat of a fever that threatened to rise. "Ilan," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. He looked down at her, his eyes dark pools in the flickering light. "I am not afraid to love you," she confessed. "Not anymore." Something shifted in the depths of his gaze. His hand, calloused and strong, rose and covered hers where it rested on his leg. "You gave my son a name," he said, his voice rough with an emotion deeper than pain. "You gave us both a place." Rachel swallowed against the ache rising in her throat. "Ilan," she began, but he was already reaching for a cord around his neck. He undid the knot and placed the object in her open hand. It was a necklace of corn kernels, dried and polished to a soft golden sheen, strung between pieces of brilliant turquoise and small carved wooden beads. At its center rested a single white seed, round and perfect. "For you," he said, "so the land will remember you are part of it now." Rachel stared at the necklace, its beauty catching the firelight. "What does it mean?" she breathed. "In my tribe," Ellen explained, "corn is life. It grows from the earth, it feeds the people, and it connects the past to what is now. This one," he touched the white seed with his fingertip, "is rare. It means a blessing, continuation." She closed her fingers around it, pressing the warmth of it to her chest. "And you would give this to me?" He simply nodded. "You are not just feeding my child. You are planting something that will live long after we are gone." Tears filled Rachel's eyes. "Then I will wear it proudly." She lifted the necklace over her head, and it settled against her collarbone, light but powerful, still warm from his touch. Outside, the wind rustled the tall grasses. Nathaniel stirred in his sleep, then settled again. Ilan leaned his head back against the chair, his breathing slowing as the fever began to recede. Rachel curled up on the floor beside him, resting her head lightly against his knee. "We'll plant in the spring," she murmured. "Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, like your people grow." He looked down at her, his expression softening into something tender. "And Nathaniel will grow strong with them." She smiled into the firelight. "I carved his name into the beam tonight," she said, "so this house will remember." Elin closed his eyes. "It already does." They sat in the quiet dark, listening to the crackle of the fire and the soft rhythm of breath, hope, and healing. Rachel's fingers curled around the necklace at her throat, and somewhere deep in her soul, something had taken root. Not just love, but belonging. Tomorrow, the world might come knocking again, with all its judgment and its fear. But tonight, there was only this warmth, the name carved into the wood above them, and the quiet, certain knowledge that a family had been born, not of blood, but of courage. The sun had nearly set when Miriam's warning came, carried on the wind. "They are coming tonight. Amos will not wait." Rachel's heart pounded as she hurriedly packed a knapsack, blankets for Nathaniel, a small loaf of bread, some jerky. Elon, moving with grim purpose, wrapped a sturdy leather sling around the baby's cradle. Moonlight streamed through the open doorway, a frail but guiding path. They slipped into the night together, Rachel clutching Nathaniel close. Elon crouched low with his rifle. They moved silently toward the timberline, their feet whispering over brittle grass. The forest loomed before them, a cathedral of shadow and hush. Elon led them deeper, the ancient trees muffling their passage as owls called in the distance. When Nathaniel whimpered once, Rachel hushed him, her own breath a prayer. They reached the creek, a ribbon of silver woven through the dark rocks, half frozen in the chill. Island paused, then signed for Rachel to follow a steep path upward, out of the valley. But just as they started to climb, a glint of moonlight flashed off a rifle barrel. Dozens of dark shapes materialized on the opposite bank. Amos and his men. They had walked into a trap. Alon pushed Rachel back against a moss-covered stump, his rifle raised, his eyes like steel. "Stay," he whispered. "Protect him." Amos stepped forward, a sneer twisting his face in the flickering lantern light. "Come on out, Apache. You, the white woman, and the brat. It's time we sent you packing." Elon's knuckles whitened on the rifle stock. Rachel hugged Nathaniel tighter, squeezing her eyes shut against the drumming of her own heart. She thought of the necklace, of the name carved into the beam, of the life they were just beginning to build. And in that moment, her courage rose like the dawn. Then a single shot rang out, not from Amos's men, but from behind them. A torch flared to life, and a tall figure emerged on the bank. Reverend Jonas Clay. And beside him, a man wearing the unmistakable glint of a federal badge. "Sheriff Valade," the man said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "Federal Marshal." Rachel blinked, her vision blurring with tears. Elon lowered his rifle slightly, wary but hopeful. "Back off, Amos," Reverend Clay's voice boomed across the creek. "This family is under protection." Amos squinted, his face a mask of shock and fury. "This is our territory." "You lost that war," the marshal replied, his tone as cold as the creek water. "This child, his mother, and his father are under the protection of the United States government. You take one more step, and you take on the United States." A nervous murmur ran through Amos's men. He spat on the ground, his eyes burning with hate. "We'll remember this." The marshal raised a hand. "Leave, now. Consider this your only warning." With a final venomous glare, Amos motioned to his men. They retreated into the darkness, their lanterns bobbing like angry fireflies, before vanishing completely. The forest seemed to breathe a collective sigh as the moonlight returned, soft and unbroken. Reverend Clay approached, his coat dusted with leaves. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentle. Elon knelt by the creek, the full weight of the night finally settling upon him. A full year had passed since that night by the water. The seasons had turned over the red hills of Lone Mesa, and the cabin had grown. A garden bloomed where there was once only dust, and the sound of laughter now echoed from the porch. Rachel had turned the old smokehouse into a one-room school, where half a dozen children, Apache and settler alike, learned their letters on benches she and Alon had built together. Inside their home, Alon spent his days carving. He shaped wood from the tall pines, his hands, which once knew only weapons, now smoothing the grain with patient care. He built a crib, sturdy and beautiful, and on its side he etched the symbols of his people: wind, protection, new beginnings. One quiet Sunday morning, as the stars still lingered in the pale sky, Elon brought Rachel to the fire circle behind their home. Strings of paper lanterns swayed between the trees, and baskets of wildflowers braided with sage scented the air. He knelt on one knee, his palm open. In it lay a silver ring, engraved with words that shimmered in the firelight. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice full of a quiet reverence. "Will you live with me? Not as mine, but as my equal." Her breath caught. She knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and pulled him close. "I am already home." Their ceremony was simple, witnessed by the few friends who had become their family. Rachel wore a dress sewn by the Apache women, its beadwork echoing the sky. They stood beneath a hand-built arch of wood and wild vines, and as they joined hands, children tossed flower petals and the lanterns were lit, rising into the twilight like stars drawn down to earth. When the final lantern had disappeared into the night, Elon led Rachel inside. He took up his carving knife and reached for the thick crossbeam above their hearth. There, beside the name he had carved for his son, he added two more, side by side: Rachel. Elon. He stepped back and looked at her. "This is our home now." Rachel touched the names, the deep grooves a permanent record of their story. A story not just of people, but of belonging. Under the endless Texas sky, two hearts once broken had chosen not just to survive, but to live together. If this story touched your heart, if you saw yourself in the firelight of two souls choosing each other against all odds, then we invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales where dusty trails lead to unexpected hearts, and where even the fiercest frontiers cannot stop the power of love. There are more stories waiting out there on the wind. Come ride with us.